Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the bill and at the outset let me say that the TasTAFE is a trusted institution. It's an institution that's provided vocational care, vocational training and custodial care for generations of Tasmanians. It has provided a pathway from unemployment to employment. It's provided a pathway from high school to careers. It's provided a pathway for industries to rebuild, to retool and to have a workforce which is fit for purpose. It is trusted. It's trusted by the Tasmanian community. It's trusted by many employers. It's in survey after survey, it has been endorsed by the Tasmanian community as a trusted entity, as a trusted training provider, and as an institution that people have faith in. Is it perfect, Mr Deputy Speaker? No, it's not. It's not perfect. And if you talk to many TAFE teachers and people who work in the system, there are always room for improvement. And they're constantly looking for ways to provide better services and better support to students and industry alike. They are constantly reframing and retooling their work with the best of their ability to respond to the needs of Tasmanian industry and the Tasmanian community. Now, we've heard a number of peak organisations and it's been quoted in the debate already today, a number of organisations saying that they endorse the government's plan. Well, I would say what they're endorsing is a better way for TAFE, is a better way for vocational education. And if you're presented with one option for that future, they're going to sign up to it because that's the only option on the table. Because what we have here is a combination of three things. There's the Liberal Party ideological view of public sector funded, controlled and run and delivered training. There's an absolute opportunistic, desperately opportunistic political opportunity taken by the government, and it's an admittance of failure, that their government is unable to meet the needs of industry, to work with TAFE to ensure that the organisation is the best it can possibly be, providing the solutions for the future workforce in multiple industries in Tasmania. It's ideological, we know this, because since the mid-80s, we've seen Liberal governments, both state and federal, dismantle public institutions that deliver good, low-cost, solid training in areas which are not economically viable. The market would make a very strong view on some of the training that's provided by the TAFE. But it's not about the market, it's about TAFE providing educational opportunities for young Tasmanians and Tasmanians that either want to change a career, build a new career, or see an opportunity in an industry that is desperate for new skilled workers. So ideologically, both state and federal over many election cycles, the Liberal governments, time and time again, have sought to unpack, unload and offload their responsibility to provide training to Tasmanians, to industry and to Tasmanians and Australians across the country. So it's ideological. I call it desperately opportunistic because we've seen, because obviously other people have spoken, other speakers have referred to the PESRAC recommendation and the single submission that was brought forward and not reflecting on the stature of on Mr Challen. I've known him for many years. He's highly respected and highly regarded, but he is conflicted to a point. He has a personal view, an ideological view around training. Doesn't make it right. And to have one submission refer to it, refer to a corporatisation, essentially, call it what it is. If it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it looks like a duck, it's a duck. It's privatisation, effectively. It's the abrogation of the government's responsibility to provide this training. So it's desperately opportunistic because the government, and under COVID, the COVID response, there was much criticism across Tasmania about the life of this government, the current Gutwin government and the previous Hodgman government, that it was just minding the shop, that it was a government that had no agenda, had no microeconomic reform, had no signature agenda that fundamentally improved and changed Tasmania apart from minding the shop. And I reckon this Premier, after reading those editorials and seeing the commentary around the state, was a little bit sort of chided by that and upset. And all of a sudden he had this PESRAC report drop in his lap, and all of a sudden he could find something that he could paint up as an agenda. And it's about training and it's about reform, and we'll privatise TAFE, we'll corporatise TAFE. We'll abrogate our responsibility that we have as a government to provide vocational training to Tasmanians. So it's desperately opportunistic for a government that has minded the shop for the last 8 years, that they found something in the PESRAC report that looks like an agenda, that looks like something that they may say we fundamentally improve the state. This is not it. This is not it. It's ideological because we've seen governments, Conservative governments over the last generation, dismantle public institutions that are valued, supported and trusted. It is desperately opportunistic because this is a government without an agenda. It just minds the shop, and it's plucked a single submission out of a recommendation for PESRAC and painted that up as a veneer of a vision for the future of Tasmania. But also, it's an admittance of failure by this government. They have put up the white flag on training. They have 8 years to improve the system and support TAFE, to work with TAFE, to work with industry, to have a functioning vocational education system. Ideologically, they've contracted out so many, and look, there are many good private providers, but we have seen time and time again when government abrogates its responsibility to ensure that good, solid delivery of training is provided, people are preyed upon. There's profit taking, there's low standards, there's poor quality outcomes for industry and for people seeking that training and undertaking that training. So the white flag has been flown, and I remember back in the last period of the last time Labor were in government, and the Leader of the Greens referred to the then Minister, and we were talking about, in 2014, we were talking about potential skill shortages across industries. We were talking about how we were going to prepare for that. And when coming back into this Parliament in 2018, I was invited to an Industry Association's forum on training, and the criticisms they had of the lack of skilled staff they had. This is in 2018. They were complaining about the lack of coherent support from the government. They weren't blaming TAFE, because TAFE is an instrument of government. TAFE is the lever you pull to respond to the needs of industry. So in 2018, they were saying, this is a real problem for us. We can't find skilled staff. We want to give Tasmanians jobs. We want to give them pathways to trades, to paraprofessional roles. We want to invest in Tasmanians, because not only do we have a skill shortage, but we want to give Tasmanians jobs, because we don't, we can't compete with mainland companies, particularly in that industry that they were referring to. So they were looking to the government for an answer and a response. And effectively, we're at the situation now where the crisis in the provision of training is acute. And it's not just in the infrastructure. We saw the Infrastructure Australia report, where effectively, which was released in October, so between now and 2025, Tasmania would need approximately double the trades workforce to deliver on public infrastructure commitments. The skill shortages in construction trades is inhibiting the industry's ability to respond to the opportunity both in the civil construction and in the building and construction sector. But it's also, we've heard time and time again, from the service industries, from disability, from aged care, from early childhood education and care, that they have skill shortages, they need support. And so the government, instead of saying, this is our responsibility, we need to respond, and you've had 8 years to respond, you've failed so many industries in terms of training. It's been held together by the goodwill of TAFE staff, desperate, who are very proud of the work they do. They get up early, You know, they provide flexible support to the businesses, employers that they work with. They're holding this system together by goodwill and their passion for the trade, their passion for the work that they do in the service sector with a whole range of industries. They're passionate about it. So it's been held together with precious little support from this government. And now, so we fit with the ideological journey. The rank opportunism with a government with a lack of an agenda trying to pluck something out of the air and essentially giving the white flag to their responsibility as government and as a minister to say, I'm going to be the one to fix this. This was a massive opportunity for this minister to say, I'm going to be the one that's going to fix this. I'm going to get my hands dirty, I'm going to roll up my sleeve, and I'm going to support the public provider because we know that's in the best interests of Tasmanians. Because we've seen when this kind of corporatisation and quasi-privatisation occurs in other states, courses get cut. TAFE is the provider of last resort. Fees go up. That's the experience interstate. Now, instead of, and we saw the response was that it was a genuine accident, but when the fees were advertised on the TAFE website that they doubled, and I'll take at face value it was an accident, maybe not. Maybe that was the intent. And they've deferred the increases to CPI for another 12 months, hopefully getting this through the two houses of Parliament, so then they can make those decisions and push fees up, further pricing Tasmanians out of the trading opportunity, further making it harder for them to get a job, a job that they would love and they're good at, that could provide for themselves and their family, put a roof over their head, food on the table. That's the fundamental role of TAFE, to provide those opportunities for young Tasmanians. But if the courses are cut, if the fees are increased, if the government essentially washes their hand of it by saying, well, it's not our responsibility because we've pushed it out to this sort of halfway house, it's not our fault. And we've seen that happen before when Hydro sacked just under 100 staff earlier this year. What was the government response to that, a GBE? It was not to stand up and fight for those jobs, got nothing to do with us. So when the minister says we're investing $100 million in TAFE, that is absolutely welcomed. That is a solid investment in TAFE. But the problem you've got now is that you say that, well, you give us these guarantees that these things won't happen, but by virtue of the legislation, you're not taking responsibility because you don't have control over that. Because it'll be very clear that fundamentally course content and delivery method is the sole discretion of the CEO and the board. So you were building up plausible deniability to say, well, I've got the minister's instructions, we're working with the board, they are separate from government, it's not our responsibility, it's not our fault. But Minister, it will be your fault. It is your responsibility. We do need to invest in TAFE. We do need to support workers building pathways to better careers and better jobs. And we need to listen to the industry by not abrogating our responsibility to respond, but by actually saying no, particularly in a rural and regional community like Tasmania, where the costs are higher, the consequences are greater for a lack of training and support, and the need for industry is acute, absolutely acute. And I don't mean just the trades industries. I'm referring, as I've said before, to early childhood education and care, disability, aged care. These are the sectors with massive employment growth. So if I were the minister and I saw this challenge, I would want to be a part of the solution, not contracting it out, my responsibility and abrogate my responsibility to a GBE or to a whatever they're calling it, this new way of calling essentially a privatised entity. And when you look at the bill, I mean, the removal of the requirement for TasTAFE teachers to be registered with the Teachers Registration Board, how does that improve teaching outcomes for students? What is that about? Is that about undermining the profession? Because it sounds like it. Is that about saying, well, we actually don't want necessarily the best qualified people to do the work, to provide the greatest range of skills to students and to industry. We want the cheapest option. So people who don't have the skills necessarily or the qualifications, or we're going to do it on the cheap. It completely undermines the integrity of the training provider. And we've seen there are so many examples of where, and I'm not tarring every private provider with this brush, but there are so many examples across the country where you get dodgy operators who do tick and flick. They take the money from the federal and the state governments. They throw these people on the unemployment scrap heap, and employers say that training's not worth a pinch. It's not worth a pinch. We won't employ them because their training is not valid. Now we want to try and access training, the support for training, but you've already trained them. They're not even AQF3. They're not even at the standard that we would have entry level for us. So if you leave it to the market, if you leave it to the unregulated sector, in degree unregulated, the outcomes are worse for working people and for industry. And we know the key thing, and it must have been listening to the speech from the budget. If you're sitting there, you're working in TAFE, you're working away in the education union that represents those workers, then all of a sudden this bomb gets dropped with little or no consultation up until that point. They thought they were having a good relationship with the government, but all of a sudden the nuclear option was pressed. We're going to sack hundreds of public servants. We're going to put them into a system that will diminish their job security, their future job security, not just in the next 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. But this diminishes their career. It undermines their passion, the work that they do, and the support they provide to Tasmanians. This is a bill which abrogates the government's responsibility to deal with what is one of the biggest problems this state faces: pathways to employment through training and skill shortages in key industries. So instead of the government, the crossroads moment, instead of the government saying, we are going to take responsibility for this, we are going to get our hands dirty, we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we are going to listen to industry, we're going to work with TAFE, we're going to work with the teachers, work with the people at the coalface to fix this, to improve it. It will never be perfect. But the commitment that I've seen firsthand in TAFEs across Tasmania is inspiring. It's inspiring. You have wonderful people. So instead of, in the middle of a Treasurer's budget speech, and then in the hotbed of an election, tell them they're not worthy effectively by your actions and that we don't trust them, you sit down and you work with them. And the job security for the EFAs, the education facility attendants. I remember back in the mid-90s when I was a young union organiser where we were protecting from contracting out. As sure as eggs, and you won't have control over this, Minister, because you're giving it away, cleaners will be contracted out. Jobs will be lost. Job insecurity will rise. That's not how, in every contemporary piece on how you deal with your labour force, you provide them with job security. You invest in them as people, you give them certainty, you give them transparency over the future of the organisation they work with. This does none of that. In fact, it's the rank opposite. It's the absolute opposite. This is a dog of a policy, and I predict it'll be knocked out by the upper house and co-signed to the dustbin of history, as it should be, because this is not the way to fix the challenges in vocational education and training in Tasmania. So this is ideological. This is desperate opportunism for an agenda for a government that has none. And this is an admittance of failure in the government's 8 years of working with TAFE and the vocational education system. Mr Deputy Speaker, I will not be voting for this bill.